Chapter 1. The Whisper of the Wind. In a small, snow-covered town nestled deep in the heart of Russia, two girls, Lena and Anya, sat huddled in the corner of a dimly lit room. The cold winter wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers down their spines. The old wooden cabin they called home creaked under the pressure of the storm, but the girls were lost in thought, oblivious to the world outside. Lena, the elder of the two at 19, had always been the more adventurous one. Her bright blue eyes sparkled with dreams of far-off places, places she had only read about in books. Anya, 17, was quieter and more reserved, but she shared her sister's longing for something more than the life they had in their isolated village. The sisters had grown up in this remote part of Russia, where the winters were long and harsh, and the summers fleeting. Their parents had passed away years ago, leaving them to fend for themselves. They had managed to survive, relying on each other and the few close friends they had in the village. But the isolation, the monotony, and the harsh reality of their lives had begun to weigh heavily on them. One evening, as the girls sat by the flickering fireplace, Lena spoke up. "Anya, we can't stay here forever. This place, it's suffocating. We need to leave, to see the world outside." Anya looked at her sister, concern etched on her face. "But how, Lena? We have no money, no passports, and no idea where to go. And what about the dangers? What if something happens to us?" Lena sighed, her expression softening. "I know it's scary, Anya, but we can't let fear hold us back. We deserve more than this. We can find a way. There must be someone who can help us." Anya bit her lip, deep in thought. She knew Lena was right. Life in the village was hard and the future looked bleak. But the thought of venturing out into the unknown was terrifying. Still, a part of her was curious, intrigued by the possibility of a different life, a better life. That night, as they lay in bed, the sisters made a pact. They would find a way to leave Russia, no matter what it took. But as they whispered their dreams to each other in the darkness, they had no idea of the challenges that lay ahead, or the dark secrets that would soon come to light. The next morning, Lena and Anya began their search for a way out. They asked around the village, hoping to find someone who knew how to travel abroad. But most people dismissed their questions, warning them of the dangers outside Russia's borders. Some even accused them of being foolish, telling them that they should be grateful for what they had. Despite the discouragement, the girls refused to give up. Days turned into weeks, and their determination grew stronger. They scoured every corner of the village, seeking out anyone who might be able to help. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they found a lead. In the outskirts of the village, there was an old man named Yuri, who was known for his mysterious ways. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, it was often in riddles. Some said he was a retired soldier. Others whispered that he had connections to the criminal underworld. But one thing was certain. Yuri had traveled far and wide, and he knew things that others did not. One cold, gray afternoon, Lena and Anya made their way to Yuri's home. The old man lived in a small, run-down shack at the edge of the forest, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. As they approached, the wind picked up, sending a chill down their spines. Lena knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing Yuri's weathered face. His eyes were sharp, and he seemed to look right through them. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. Lena swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "We need your help. We want to leave Russia, but we don't know how." Yuri's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the girls feared he would slam the door in their faces. But instead he stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. The inside of Yuri's shack was cluttered with strange objects, maps, old books, and trinkets from far-off places. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "You're not the first to ask," Yuri said, sitting down in a rickety old chair. "But leaving this place, it's not easy. There are risks, and many have tried and failed. What makes you think you can succeed?" Lena glanced at Anya before answering. "We don't have much, but we have each other. We're determined, and we're willing to do whatever it takes." Yuri studied them for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well, I'll help you. But know this, once you start down this path, there's no turning back. You'll face dangers you can't even imagine. Are you ready for that?" The sisters exchanged a nervous glance, but nodded in unison. They knew there was no going back now. Yuri leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's a way out, but it's not straightforward. You'll need to go through several steps, and you'll need to be careful. The first thing you'll need is a contact, someone who can guide you out of the country." He paused, his eyes glinting with a mix of caution and something else, something dark. "There's a man in St. Petersburg, someone who owes me a favor. His name is Victor, and he can help you get what you need. But be warned, Victor is not a man to be trifled with. You'll need to earn his trust, and that won't be easy." Lena and Anya listened intently, their hearts racing. The journey was beginning, but already they could feel the weight of the risks they were taking. As they left Yuri's shack and walked back through the forest, the wind howled even louder, as if it were trying to warn them of the dangers ahead. But the girls pressed on, determined to follow through with their plan. As they approached the edge of the forest, Anya suddenly stopped, her eyes wide with fear. "Lena, look!" Lena turned to see what had startled her sister. There, hidden in the shadows of the trees, was a figure watching them. It was too dark to make out any details, but the presence was unmistakable. A sense of dread washed over the sisters as they realized that someone or something was following them. They had no idea who it was or what they wanted, but they knew one thing for certain. Their journey had just become much more dangerous. The figure melted back into the darkness, leaving the sisters standing alone in the clearing, their hearts pounding with fear and uncertainty. The first step had been taken, but already the path ahead was shrouded in mystery and danger. Chapter 2. The Shadow of St. Petersburg. The train ride to St. Petersburg was long and uneventful, but Lena and Anya couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Ever since they had seen the mysterious figure in the forest, an uneasy tension had settled over them. They kept their voices low, afraid that someone might overhear their plans. As the train rumbled on, Lena stared out the window, watching the snow-covered landscape blur by. The further they got from their village, the more surreal everything seemed. They were really doing it. They were leaving Russia, or at least trying to. But the path ahead was filled with uncertainty. When they finally arrived in St. Petersburg, the sisters were overwhelmed by the sheer size of the city. It was a far cry from their small village, with its narrow streets and ancient buildings. Here, the streets were wide and bustling with people, and the buildings towered over them, casting long shadows on the icy pavement. Lena pulled out the piece of paper Yuri had given her, with Victor's address scrawled in his messy handwriting. We need to find Victor. He's our only chance. Anya nodded, but her eyes were wide with apprehension. Do you think we can trust him? Lena hesitated, then shrugged. We don't have much of a choice. Yuri said he could help us, and we have to take that chance. Navigating the city proved to be a challenge. The cold wind bit at their faces, and the streets were a confusing maze of unfamiliar landmarks. But after what felt like hours, they finally found the address. A rundown apartment building on the outskirts of the city. The building was old and decrepit, with peeling paint and broken windows. Lena and Anya exchanged a nervous glance before entering. The hallway was dimly lit, and the smell of damp and mold hung in the air. They climbed the creaking stairs to the third floor, where Victor's apartment was located. Lena took a deep breath and knocked on the door. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, they heard footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, thin man with dark hair and a scruffy beard. His eyes were cold and calculating, and he looked them up and down with an air of suspicion. You must be Yuri's friends, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Lena nodded, trying to appear confident. Yes. He said you could help us leave Russia. Victor studied them for a moment, then stepped aside to let them in. The inside of his apartment was sparse, with little more than a few pieces of worn furniture and stacks of old newspapers scattered across the floor. The air was thick with the smell of cigarette smoke, and the only light came from a flickering lamp on the table. "Sit down," Victor said, gesturing to the worn-out couch. The sisters did as they were told, their nerves on edge. Victor took a seat across from them, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "So, you want to leave Russia?" he began, his voice cold and detached. "Do you have any idea what you're getting yourselves into? This isn't a game. If you're caught, there will be consequences, serious consequences." Lena swallowed hard, but she didn't waver. "We know the risks, but we can't stay here. We need to get out." Victor's eyes narrowed as he studied them. "Yuri said you were determined. That's good. But determination alone won't get you across the border. You'll need money, connections, and most importantly, you'll need to keep your mouths shut. No one can know what you're planning. Do you understand?" The sisters nodded in unison, their faces pale. The gravity of the situation was sinking in, but there was no turning back now. Victor leaned back in his chair, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "There's a way out, but it won't be easy. I can arrange for fake passports and transport, but it'll cost you. Do you have any money?" Lena hesitated before answering. "We've saved up some money over the years, but it's not much." Victor's expression remained unreadable as he considered their words. "It'll be enough for now. But understand this. Once you're out, you're on your own. I can get you to the border, but after that, you'll have to find your own way. Do you still want to go through with this?" Lena and Anya exchanged a glance, and then Lena spoke for both of them. "Yes, we're ready." Victor nodded, his expression grim. "Very well. I'll make the arrangements, but it'll take some time. In the meantime, you'll need to lay low. Stay out of sight, and don't talk to anyone you don't trust. There are eyes everywhere, and if anyone catches wind of what you're planning, it'll be over before it even begins." He stood up and walked to a small cabinet, pulling out a map and spreading it out on the table. "You'll leave from here," he said, pointing to a small town near the border. "There's a train that runs through the town, and from there you can cross into Finland. But be careful. The border is heavily guarded, and the patrols are unpredictable. You'll need to move quickly and quietly." Lena and Anya studied the map, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. This was it, their way out. But the journey ahead was fraught with danger, and one wrong move could cost them everything. As they prepared to leave Victor's apartment, he stopped them at the door. "One more thing," he said, his voice low. "There's someone you need to watch out for. A man named Sergei. He's been following people like you, trying to catch them before they can leave. No one knows who he works for, but he's dangerous. If you see him, run. Don't try to reason with him. Don't try to fight him. Just run. Understand?" The sisters nodded, their faces pale. The mysterious figure in the forest flashed in their minds, and they couldn't help but wonder if it had been Sergei. With that, Victor handed them a small envelope. Inside, you'll find the money and instructions you'll need. Don't open it until you're on the train. And remember, trust no one. Lena and Anya thanked Victor and left the apartment, their minds racing with everything they had just learned. As they stepped out into the cold night air, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The streets of St. Petersburg were eerily quiet, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. They hurried back to their temporary lodging, a small, run-down hostel on the outskirts of the city. The building was old and creaky, but it was cheap and anonymous, just what they needed. As they entered their room, Lena carefully locked the door behind them and slid the bolt into place. Anya sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. Lena, do you think we can really do this? What if something goes wrong? Lena sat beside her sister, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We have to believe we can. We've come this far and we can't turn back now. We'll be careful, we'll stick to the plan, and we'll get out of here, together. Anya nodded, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. I just can't stop thinking about that man, Sergei. What if he finds us? What if he's already watching us? Lena didn't have an answer for that. The thought of Sergei was terrifying, and the idea that he could be lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike, sent a chill down her spine. But she couldn't let Anya see her fear. We'll be careful, she repeated, trying to sound confident. We'll stay out of sight, and we'll stick to the plan. Victor wouldn't have helped us if he didn't think we could make it. As the sisters settled in for the night, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The room was silent except for the occasional creak of the old building, but every sound made them jump. The suspense was unbearable, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. Just as they were about to fall asleep, there was a sudden noise outside their door, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. The sisters froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The footsteps stopped right outside their door, and for a moment there was only silence. Then there was a soft knock. Lena and Anya exchanged a terrified glance. Who could it be at this hour? Had Sergei found them already? Had someone else discovered their plan? Lena motioned for Anya to stay quiet as she carefully crept toward the door. She pressed her ear against it, listening for any sound. The silence was deafening, and she could feel her heart racing. After what felt like an eternity, Lena slowly turned the lock and opened the door just a crack. But when she peered out into the hallway, there was no one there. The corridor was empty, the only light coming from a dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. Lena's mind raced. Had they imagined the footsteps? Was it just their fear playing tricks on them? Or was someone really out there, watching and waiting? As she closed the door and turned back to Anya, her heart still pounding, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer alone. The tension in the air was palpable, and the sense of impending danger hung over them like a dark cloud. The journey had only just begun, but already the sisters were on edge, haunted by the unknown threats that lurked in the shadows. And as they lay in the darkness, the suspense only grew, leaving them to wonder what terrifying twist awaited them next. Chapter 3. The Train to Nowhere. The next morning, the sisters awoke with a sense of dread. The events of the previous night had left them shaken, and the knowledge that Sergei might be tracking them made every moment feel like a ticking time bomb. Despite their fears, they knew they had to stick to their plan. After a quick breakfast, they packed their few belongings and made their way to the train station, following Victor's instructions to the letter. The station was bustling with people, a chaotic mix of travelers, soldiers, and merchants. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and the distant sound of train whistles. Lena and Anya kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. They purchased their tickets and boarded the train bound for the small town near the Finnish border, just as Victor had instructed. The train was old and crowded, with passengers crammed into every available seat and standing space. The sisters found a small compartment near the back and settled in, grateful for a moment of relative privacy. As the train pulled out of the station, the sisters felt a brief sense of relief. They were on their way, moving closer to the border and further from the dangers of St. Petersburg. But the relief was short-lived. The tension inside the compartment was palpable, and every clank of the wheels on the tracks seemed to echo with a sense of impending doom. The train journey was long, and the sisters spent most of it in silence, too afraid to speak. They kept a close eye on the other passengers, watching for any sign of trouble. Every time the train stopped at a station, their hearts would race, fearing that Sergei might be waiting for them on the platform. As the train chugged along, the landscape outside changed from the urban sprawl of St. Petersburg to the vast, snow-covered wilderness of rural Russia. The towns grew smaller and farther apart, and soon they were traveling through a desolate stretch of forest, where the trees stood tall and foreboding, like silent sentinels. It was during one of these stretches that the train suddenly slowed down, coming to an unexpected stop in the middle of nowhere. The abrupt halt jolted Lena and Anya out of their uneasy silence. They exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to expect. The other passengers in their compartment seemed equally puzzled, and a few of them began to murmur anxiously, wondering what could have caused the train to stop so suddenly. Lena peered out the window, but all she could see were the dense trees of the forest surrounding the train. There was no station in sight, No sign of civilization. Just the thick blanket of snow covering the ground and the dark looming trees. "Why have we stopped?" Anya whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "I don't know," Lena replied, her eyes scanning the landscape for any clues. "Maybe there's something on the tracks." But as the minutes passed and the train remained stationary, Lena's unease grew. There was no announcement from the conductor, no explanation for the delay. The stillness outside felt oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The door to their compartment slid open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a heavy coat stepped inside. He was a stranger, someone they hadn't noticed earlier, and his presence sent a chill down Lena's spine. The man looked around the compartment, his gaze lingering on each passenger before finally settling on Lena and Anya. His eyes were cold and calculating, and there was something about him that made Lena instinctively tense. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low and gruff. "I'm looking for two young women who might be traveling alone. Have you seen anyone fitting that description?" Lena's heart skipped a beat. Was this Sergei? Had he found them already? She forced herself to remain calm, but she could feel Anya trembling beside her. "We haven't seen anyone," Lena replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's just us in here." The man narrowed his eyes, as if assessing whether or not to believe her. The tension in the compartment was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Lena could feel the other passengers watching the exchange with bated breath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man nodded and stepped back into the corridor. "If you see anyone matching that description, let the conductor know immediately," he said before turning and walking away. As soon as he was gone, Lena let out a shaky breath, her hands clenched into fists. Anya looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. "Lena, what if that was him? What if he's looking for us?" "I don't know," Lena admitted, her mind racing. "But we can't stay here. We need to get off this train as soon as we can." "But we're in the middle of nowhere," Anya protested. "Where would we go?" Lena bit her lip, thinking fast. The situation was dire, and every instinct told her they were running out of time. "We can't stay on this train," she repeated. "We need to find a way to get out of here before he comes back." Just as Lena was about to suggest a plan, the train suddenly lurched forward, slowly beginning to move again. The tension in the compartment eased slightly, but Lena knew they weren't out of danger yet. "We have to act now," Lena said, her voice urgent. "We'll wait until the next station and then get off. We can't risk staying on this train any longer." Anya nodded, though her fear was evident. "What if he follows us?" "We'll find a way to lose him," Lena assured her. "But we can't wait. The longer we stay on this train, the more likely it is that he'll find us." The sisters waited in tense silence as the train continued its journey through the forest. The minutes felt like hours, and every sound outside the compartment made them jump. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the train began to slow down again, this time pulling into a small, remote station. "This is our chance," Lena whispered, grabbing Anya's hand. "Let's go." They quickly gathered their belongings and slipped out of the compartment, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. The station was tiny, with only a handful of passengers getting off, and Lena prayed that the man from earlier wouldn't notice them. As they stepped onto the platform, the cold air hit them like a slap in the face. The station was eerily quiet, with only the distant sound of the wind howling through the trees. Lena glanced around, her heart pounding in her chest. They were in the middle of nowhere, with no idea where to go next. But they had no choice. They couldn't afford to stay on the train and risk being caught. As the train pulled away from the station, leaving them behind, Lena and Anya were left standing alone on the platform. The small station was deserted, with no sign of anyone around. The sisters exchanged a nervous glance, the reality of their situation sinking in. "What do we do now?" Anya asked, her voice trembling. Lena looked around, her mind racing. They needed to find a way to keep moving, to stay ahead of whoever was following them. But in the middle of this remote, snow-covered wilderness, their options were limited. "We'll have to walk," Lena said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "There has to be a town nearby. We'll head in that direction and find shelter." Anya looked hesitant, but she nodded, knowing they had little choice. Together, the sisters began to walk away from the station, the snow crunching under their boots as they made their way into the forest. The trees loomed above them, casting long shadows on the snowy ground. The wind picked up, biting at their exposed skin and making the cold even more unbearable. Lena led the way, trying to keep her sister close. But with every step, the forest seemed to close in around them, the silence almost deafening. After what felt like hours of trudging through the snow, Lena noticed a faint light in the distance, flickering through the trees. Her heart leaped with hope. "Look, Anya, there's something up ahead. Maybe it's a house or a cabin. We can take shelter there." Anya followed Lena's gaze and nodded eagerly. "Yes, let's hurry." With renewed determination, they quickened their pace, heading toward the light. As they drew closer, they could make out the outline of a small cabin nestled among the trees. Smoke curled up from the chimney, a sign that someone was inside. "Thank goodness," Anya whispered, relief evident in her voice. "We might finally be safe." But as they approached the cabin, a sudden sense of unease washed over Lena. The light from the windows cast long, eerie shadows on the snow, and something about the place felt off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. "Wait," Lena said, grabbing Anya's arm just as they were about to reach the door. "Something doesn't feel right." Anya frowned, confused. "What do you mean? We need to get inside before we freeze." "I know, but just be careful," Lena warned, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the surroundings. "Let's knock first and see who's inside." Anya reluctantly agreed, and Lena stepped forward, knocking on the cabin door. They waited in tense silence, but there was no response. Lena knocked again, louder this time, but still, no one answered. "Maybe they're not home," Anya suggested, though her voice was tinged with doubt. "Or maybe they don't want to be found," Lena replied, her unease growing. Just as they were about to turn away, the door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark interior of the cabin. The sisters exchanged a nervous glance, unsure of what to do next. "Hello?" Lena called out, her voice echoing in the silence. "Is anyone there?" There was no answer, only the sound of the wind howling outside. But as they stood there, peering into the darkness, Lena noticed something strange. The light they had seen earlier was still flickering inside, but it wasn't coming from a lamp or a fire. It was coming from a single candle, burning on a table in the middle of the room. Lena's heart began to race as she realized that something was very wrong. The cabin was too quiet, too still. It was as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry, but the candle still burned, as if someone had been there just moments before. "Something's not right," Lena whispered, backing away from the door. "We need to get out of here." But before they could move, the door suddenly slammed shut with a loud bang, trapping them inside. Anya screamed, and Lena felt her blood run cold as they were plunged into darkness. The sisters were now trapped in the cabin with no idea who or what had brought them there. The suspense was unbearable, and as they fumbled for the door in the pitch black, they knew that whatever waited for them in the darkness was far more terrifying than anything they had faced before. Chapter 4. The Darkness Within. Panic set in as the darkness enveloped Lena and Anya. They frantically searched for the door, but it seemed to have vanished, leaving them trapped in the cabin with no way out. The only light was the flickering candle, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Lena! What's happening?" Anya cried, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Lena replied, trying to stay calm. "But we need to find a way out of here now." The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, and Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she felt her way along the cold, rough wooden walls, searching for any sign of an exit. Anya clung to her, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The cabin was small, but in the pitch black, it felt like a labyrinth, each step echoing ominously. The flickering candlelight cast shadows that danced eerily, giving the illusion of movement. Lena knew they couldn't afford to stay in the cabin any longer. There was something deeply unsettling about the place, as if it held secrets they were not meant to uncover. Suddenly, they heard a faint creaking sound, like the groan of old wood under pressure. It seemed to come from above them, and both girls froze, holding their breath. The sound grew louder, then abruptly stopped. Lena strained her ears, trying to make out what it could be, but the silence that followed was more unnerving than the noise itself. "Lena, I'm scared," Anya whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know, Anya," Lena whispered back, trying to keep her own fear in check. "We'll get out of here. We just have to stay calm." As they stood there, Lena's eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light. She could make out the rough outlines of the furniture, a table, a few chairs, and what appeared to be a staircase leading up to a loft. The candle on the table flickered again, casting long shadows on the walls. "We should try upstairs," Lena suggested, though every instinct told her to stay as far away from the loft as possible. "Are you sure?" Anya asked, hesitating. "We don't have a choice," Lena said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. "There might be another way out up there." With Anya close behind, Lena cautiously approached the staircase. Each step creaked under their weight, the sound echoing ominously in the confined space. The staircase was narrow and steep, leading up to a dark, shadowy loft. As they reached the top, Lena could make out the faint outlines of what looked like old, dusty furniture: an armchair, a small table, and a bed covered in a tattered blanket. But there was no sign of another door, no windows, no escape. "Lena, what if we're trapped?" Anya's voice was trembling. "Don't think like that," Lena said, trying to sound confident. "There has to be a way out. We just haven't found it yet." But as they searched the loft, a new sound caught their attention. A soft, almost imperceptible whispering. It seemed to come from all around them, like the cabin itself was alive and murmuring secrets. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until Lena could almost make out the words, though they were in a language she didn't understand. Anya clutched Lena's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Lena, we need to leave. Now." Lena nodded, her heart pounding. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, and every fiber of her being screamed at her to get out of the cabin. But how? The door had disappeared, and there was no other exit. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, plunging the cabin into an oppressive silence. Lena and Anya stood frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, without warning, the candle on the table flickered violently before going out, plunging them into complete darkness. Anya screamed, and Lena grabbed her hand, pulling her back toward the staircase. They stumbled down the steps, nearly falling in their haste to get out of the loft. But as they reached the bottom, they were met with an unexpected sight. The door was there, wide open, as if beckoning them to leave. Lena didn't hesitate. She pulled Anya toward the door, and together they stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The forest outside was dark and foreboding, but anything was better than the terrifying confines of the cabin. But as they stepped outside, Lena realized something was wrong. The forest was eerily silent, and the snow-covered ground seemed untouched, as if no one had passed through in years. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting long, ominous shadows in the moonlight. And then Lena noticed something else. The cabin was gone. They stood in the middle of an empty clearing with no sign of the structure they had just escaped from. The realization sent a cold shiver down her spine. "Lena, where did it go?" Anya whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Lena replied, her mind racing. "But we need to keep moving. We can't stay here." They started walking, not knowing where they were going, only that they needed to get away from whatever dark force had been in that cabin. But as they made their way through the forest, a new fear gripped Lena's heart. What if they were lost? What if they never found their way out of the forest? The trees seemed to close in around them, and every shadow looked like it hid some unseen danger. The wind picked up, howling through the branches and sending chills down their spines. But despite their fear, they kept moving, driven by the need to survive. Hours seemed to pass as they wandered through the forest, the cold biting at their skin and the darkness pressing in on all sides. Just when it seemed like they might be lost forever, Lena spotted something through the trees, a faint light flickering in the distance. "Anya, look," Lena said, pointing. "There's a light up ahead." Anya followed her gaze and nodded, though she was clearly terrified. "Do you think it's safe?" "I don't know," Lena admitted. "But it's our only option. We have to take the chance." With renewed determination, they headed toward the light. As they drew closer, they realized it was coming from a small village nestled in a clearing in the forest. The village looked old and worn, with crumbling buildings and narrow, winding streets. But it was inhabited, and that meant there might be help. The sisters entered the village cautiously, keeping to the shadows as they made their way down the deserted streets. The few villagers they saw looked weary and downtrodden, their faces etched with hardship. But Lena felt a flicker of hope. At least they were no longer alone. As they approached the center of the village, they saw a small inn, its windows glowing warmly in the cold night. Lena led Anya toward it, hoping they might find shelter there. But as they reached the door, it suddenly creaked open, and a figure stepped out. Lena's heart skipped a beat, as she recognized the man from the train, the one who had been looking for them. "Well, well," the man said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "I knew I'd find you two eventually." Anya gasped, and Lena instinctively stepped in front of her sister, shielding her from the man's gaze. "Stay back," Lena warned, her voice trembling. The man chuckled, taking a step closer. "You've led me on quite the chase, girls, but it ends here. You're coming with me." Lena's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. They were cornered with no weapons and no escape, but she couldn't let him take them. She wouldn't let it end this way. In a desperate bid to buy time, Lena grabbed a handful of snow from the ground and hurled it at the man's face. He recoiled in surprise, giving Lena the momentary advantage she needed. "Run, Anya!" she shouted, grabbing her sister's hand and pulling her down the street. They sprinted through the village, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they dodged through narrow alleys and twisted streets. The man's footsteps pounded behind them, growing louder with each passing second. As they rounded a corner, Lena spotted an old, crumbling church at the edge of the village. "In here!" she gasped, dragging Anya toward the church. They burst through the church doors, slamming them shut behind them. The interior was dark and cold, with broken pews and shattered stained glass windows. But there was no time to take in their surroundings. Lena searched frantically for a place to hide. "Over there!" Anya pointed to a small alcove at the back of the church, partially hidden behind a broken altar. They squeezed into the alcove, their hearts pounding as they tried to quiet their breathing. The sound of the man's footsteps outside grew louder, and Lena knew it was only a matter of time before he found them. The church door creaked open, and Lena heard the man's heavy boots on the stone floor. He moved slowly, methodically, as if savoring the moment. Come out, wherever you are," he taunted, his voice echoing in the empty church. Lena held her breath, praying that he wouldn't find them. But the footsteps drew closer, and Lena knew their time was running out. Then, just as the man's shadow fell over their hiding spot, a loud crash echoed through the church. The man cursed and spun around, distracted by the noise. Lena peeked out from the alcove and saw a figure standing at the entrance, an old woman, her face obscured by a hood. "You're not welcome here," the woman said, her voice strong and commanding. The man hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Who are you?" he demanded. But the woman didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand, and the air around her seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly energy. The man took a step back, suddenly unsure of himself. "Leave now." Lena watched in awe as the old woman stood her ground, her presence commanding and mysterious. The man, who had been so sure of himself moments ago, now looked uncertain, even fearful. The air in the church seemed to pulse with an unseen force, and Lena could feel the energy emanating from the woman as if the very space around her was charged with power. I said, "Leave now," the old woman repeated, her voice low but firm. The man's bravado faltered. He glanced back at Lena and Anya's hiding spot, then at the woman, clearly weighing his options. But something about the woman's presence seemed to unnerve him, and he took another step back, his confidence crumbling. "This isn't over," he spat, but his voice lacked its earlier menace. He turned on his heel and fled the church, his footsteps echoing through the cold night. The old woman waited until the man was out of sight before turning to Lena and Anya. She lowered her hood, revealing a face lined with age but full of wisdom and strength. Her piercing eyes softened as she looked at the two sisters, who were still huddled in the alcove. "It's safe now," she said gently. "You can come out." Lena hesitated for a moment before stepping out from their hiding place, pulling Anya with her. They approached the woman cautiously, still unsure of what to make of the strange turn of events. "Who are you?" Lena asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why did you help us?" The old woman smiled, a kind and knowing expression. "My name is Irina," she said. "I've lived in this village for many years, and I've seen many things. I knew you would come here, and I knew you would need help." Lena frowned, confused. "How did you know we were coming? And who was that man?" Irina's smile faded slightly as she sighed, her eyes taking on a distant look. "The man who was chasing you is dangerous, but he's not the one you should be most afraid of. There are forces at work here that you do not understand, but you've already seen some of them." Lena exchanged a glance with Anya, who looked just as bewildered. "What do you mean?" Lena asked. "What forces?" Irina looked at them both, her expression serious. "This village, this forest, it's not like other places. There are old powers here, ancient spirits that have protected this land for centuries. They've been watching you since you entered the forest, and they guided you here to me." Anya shivered, instinctively moving closer to Lena. "Are we in danger?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Irina shook her head. "Not anymore. The spirits have chosen to protect you. The man who was after you will not return. And as long as you stay within the village, you will be safe." Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by a new worry. "But we can't stay here forever," she said. "We were trying to leave Russia to find a new life somewhere else." Irina nodded, as if she already knew. "I understand. And the spirits do too. They will help you, but you must be patient. There is a path you must follow, and it will not be easy, but you will find your way out of this forest, and out of Russia. Lena and Anya exchanged hopeful glances. How do we do that? Lena asked. Irina reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden charm. She handed it to Lena, who examined it curiously. The charm was shaped like a small, twisted tree, with strange symbols carved into its surface. This charm will guide you, Irina explained. It's a token of the spirit's protection. Keep it with you, and when the time is right, it will show you the way. But you must be careful. There are still dangers ahead, and you must trust in each other and in the spirits. Lena closed her hand around the charm, feeling its warmth. She looked at Irina, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "We don't know how to repay you." Irina smiled gently. "There's no need for thanks. Just remember what I've told you and be brave. The spirits will watch over you, but you must also trust in yourselves. Your journey is not over yet, but you will find your way." With that, Irina turned and began to walk toward the door of the church. She paused at the threshold and looked back at them one last time. "When you leave the village, follow the path to the east. It will take you where you need to go. And whatever happens, don't lose faith. You're stronger than you know." Lena and Anya nodded, their resolve strengthened by her words. They watched as Irina disappeared into the night, leaving them alone in the quiet church. For a long moment, the sisters stood in silence, processing everything that had happened. Finally, Anya spoke, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Do you think we can do this, Lena?" Lena looked down at the wooden charm in her hand, feeling the warmth of it radiating through her. She thought about everything they had been through, the dangerous journey, the terror in the cabin, the man who had pursued them relentlessly. But they had made it this far, and now, with the spirit's protection, they had a real chance. "Yes, Anya," Lena said, her voice steady and confident. "We can do this. We've come too far to turn back now. We'll find our way out, and we'll find the life we've been dreaming of." Anya smiled, her fear slowly giving way to hope. "I believe you, Lena. Let's do this together." With renewed determination, the sisters left the church, stepping out into the cold night once more. They followed Irina's instructions and made their way through the village, heading east. The forest loomed ahead, dark and mysterious, but this time they weren't afraid. As they walked, the wooden charm in Lena's hand seemed to pulse with a gentle warmth, guiding them forward. The path ahead was uncertain, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges to face. But Lena and Anya were ready. They had each other. They had the spirit's protection. And most importantly, they had hope. And so, with the moonlight shining down on the snow-covered path, the two sisters ventured into the unknown, their hearts full of determination. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Their journey was far from over, but they knew one thing for sure. They would never give up. And somewhere in the depths of the ancient forest, the spirits watched over them, silently guiding them toward the destiny that awaited. The end.